Karen Grassle has carried this story for decades. She never spoke about it when Little House on the Prairie was at its peak. She stayed silent through the reruns, through the reunions, through every interview where fans begged for more about her time with Michael Landon. She had her reasons, because what she saw behind the camera was nothing like the man America believed they knew. The smiles, the charm, the fatherly warmth, it was all there on screen. Yet off-screen, there were moments she could never forget. Moments that left her questioning not just the man, but the entire dream they were building together. Now, after years of holding back, Karen is finally telling the truth. And it changes everything fans thought they knew about Michael Landon. When Karen Grassle first stepped onto the set of Little House on the Prairie in 1973, she felt the rush of possibility. She had been cast as Caroline Ingalls, the matriarch of a frontier family that would soon become a fixture in American homes. For millions of viewers, the role would define her. For Karen, it was a chance to bring a warmth and dignity to television's depiction of family life. Michael Landon, already a household name from Bonanza, was not only the star of the show, but its executive producer, head writer, and creative driver. His presence dominated the set from the first day. He greeted Karen with an easy smile and the kind of charisma that could light up an entire soundstage. He had a way of making people feel instantly welcome, drawing them into his orbit. In those early days, the production felt like a family. The cast gathered around the outdoor sets in Simi Valley, enduring long days under the sunday. The children, both in character and in real life, looked up to Landon as a father figure. Karen watched him with the younger cast members, noting how he could make them laugh one moment and focus the next. She admired that skill. Yet even in those first weeks, Karen began to notice something else. Something that didn't align perfectly with the wholesome image that viewers would come to adore. Michael was not just the star. He was the decision-maker, the arbiter of what stayed in the script and what was cut. His word was final. And while his vision for Little House was clear, his methods could sometimes feel abrupt, even sharp. As a trained stage actress from the American Conservatory Theater, Karen came from a background that valued collaboration and respect for the ensemble. On Little House, she learned quickly that collaboration happened only when Michael allowed it. Most of the time, the ideas flowed one way down from him. She adapted, focusing on her role and trying to keep her attention on the work, not the politics. During that first season, Karen began to see how much Michael's personal life intertwined with the production. He was known for keeping the atmosphere lively, sometimes through humor that could be off-color by today's standards. On long shooting days, those jokes could cut the tension, but they could also leave some cast and crew uneasy. Karen often found herself caught between appreciating his energy and feeling the weight of moments when the tone shifted. Still, in those early years, she kept any concerns to herself. The show was a hit almost immediately. Viewers fell in love with the Ingalls family, and Michael became a symbol of steadfast fatherhood in a time when American television was craving stability. Ratings soared, and Little House became more than a job. It became a cultural touchstone. Karen knew that speaking out about her reservations would not only risk her relationship with Michael, but also potentially jeopardize her role on the show. She had worked too hard to get here. The opportunity was rare, especially for women in television at the time. So she made the choice to stay silent, focusing instead on building Caroline into a character audiences could trust. But even in those early seasons, the foundation was being laid for the fracture that would one day come between them. Karen didn't know it then, but the same man who had welcomed her so warmly to the set would also be the reason she would one day question everything she thought she knew about the family they had built on screen. By the middle of the second season of Little House on the Prairie, the warm family dynamic that had charmed audiences was becoming more complex behind the scenes. The show was still a ratings powerhouse, and Michael Landon's image as the ideal television father remained untouchable. Yet, for those working closest to him, the atmosphere could shift without warning. Karen Grassle began to feel the imbalance more acutely. As Caroline Ingalls, she was meant to be a central figure, a grounding force for the family. But when scripts arrived, she often found her role shrinking, her most meaningful scenes cut or reassigned. Michael was not just the star. He had control over every script rewrite. If he felt a scene didn't serve the direction he wanted, it was gone. At first, Karen told herself it was part of the process. Television was collaborative, and changes were inevitable. But over time, a pattern emerged. Michael's character was always the emotional core, while others, especially the women, were often left on the sidelines. The father figure's wisdom would close the episode, even if the storyline had begun with Caroline's perspective. Karen noticed how Michael's leadership style demanded loyalty. He worked at an exhausting pace, setting a tone that expected others to match his energy without question. Those who did were rewarded with his warmth and humor. Those who didn't could find themselves ignored, or worse, frozen out of the creative conversation. There were days when his charm seemed to vanish entirely. If a scene was behind schedule, if the weather disrupted filming, or if he simply didn't like the way a line was delivered, his frustration showed. Sometimes it was sharp words, other times it was a pointed silence. Michael had an intensity that could be inspiring when things went well, but intimidating when they didn't. Karen, used to the camaraderie of the theater, found this challenging. She wanted to approach the work as equals, to have the space to shape Caroline in a way that felt authentic. But the more she tried to bring ideas to the table, the clearer it became that her input was welcome only if it matched Michael's vision. There were moments when the tension eased. Between takes, Michael could still make her laugh. He could be generous with praise, especially when a scene landed exactly the way he imagined it. But those moments didn't erase the undercurrent. She began to sense that their professional relationship rested on a fragile balance, one that could tip without warning. As the seasons went on, Karen also became aware of how differently Michael treated the younger cast members. He had a soft spot for them, often giving them more flexibility and encouragement. With the adults, particularly the women, his standards were stricter. He expected them to adapt quickly, to fall in line without hesitation. For Karen, this double standard became harder to ignore. Still, she kept her concerns private. In the 1970s, speaking openly about workplace dynamics, especially on a hit television show, was risky. She didn't want to be seen as difficult, and she didn't want to jeopardize her future in the industry. So she smiled in interviews, praised Michael's talent, and let the public believe the Little House set was as wholesome as the Prairie home they saw on screen. What the public couldn't see was that Karen was already wrestling with questions that would take decades to answer. Was her silence protecting her career, or was it costing her something more personal? It would take many years, and the perspective of time for her to confront that question. And when she finally did, it would bring her to the point she had avoided for so long, telling the truth about what it was really like to work with Michael Landon. By the late 1970s, Little House on the Prairie was not just a successful television show, it was a cultural institution. The faces of Michael Landon, Melissa Gilbert, and Karen Grassle had become part of America's weekly routine. Fans felt they knew these characters intimately, as if they were members of their own families. For Karen, the irony was that her relationship with Michael behind the scenes was becoming increasingly distant, even as the audience imagined them as inseparable. The shift was gradual, but unmistakable. Scripts began arriving with fewer lines for Caroline, and when Karen pushed for more meaningful material, she often met resistance. Michael, juggling the roles of star, producer, writer, and sometimes director, had little patience for anything that slowed his pace. In his mind, the formula worked. Episodes that centered on Charles Ingalls drew the strongest ratings, so that's where the focus remained. Karen felt the change most during contract negotiations. She was earning far less than Michael, despite being the female lead. When she raised the issue, she was told that salaries were based on screen value and that Michael's role simply carried more weight. It was an answer she couldn't accept, but at the time, she knew she had little leverage. Television in that era was still dominated by men, and questioning pay equity was almost unheard of. Still, she pushed carefully. In interviews years later, she would say that advocating for herself came with a price. Michael was not a man who enjoyed being challenged, and after the salary dispute, their dynamic shifted further. He was less likely to engage in casual conversation, more likely to keep their interactions strictly professional. It was during this period that Karen began to see the emotional toll her silence was taking. She had always believed in the importance of teamwork, of building a character in partnership with the writers and producers. But on Little House, that ideal had eroded. She was fulfilling the role the audience loved, yet behind the scenes, she felt like a supporting player in her own story. The breaking point came during a season when the production schedule was especially grueling. Scenes were being rewritten on the fly, and long days stretched into nights. One afternoon, after delivering a performance she felt particularly proud of, she learned that the scene had been cut entirely. It wasn't about timing, she was told. It simply didn't fit the narrative Michael wanted. For Karen, it was more than just a creative disagreement. It was a reminder that her contributions could be erased in an instant, no matter how much care she put into them. She left the set that day with a hollow feeling, one that lingered through the rest of the season. From that point forward, she kept a careful distance. She did her work, she remained professional, but she stopped expecting the kind of collaboration she had once hoped for. And with that distance came a decision. She would not share her frustrations publicly. Not then. Not while the show was still airing. Not while Michael was alive. Her reasons were layered. Part of it was respect for the fans, for the cast, for the image of the Ingalls family that meant so much to so many. Part of it was self-preservation. The entertainment industry could be unforgiving to those who spoke out, especially women who challenged powerful men. But part of it was also something deeper, something she wouldn't fully admit until decades later. She still carried a complicated affection for Michael Landon. For all the moments that left her frustrated, there were also moments of real kindness, moments when his energy and vision inspired her. To speak out in the middle of it all felt impossible. It would take time, distance, and the safety of knowing her career no longer depended on Little House for her to finally tell the full truth. And when she did, the story she told was not the one fans were expecting. When Little House on the Prairie ended in 1983, Karen Grassle quietly stepped away from the character that had defined her career. She pursued other acting projects, returned to the theater, and built a life outside the glare of weekly television. Michael Landon moved on as well, producing and starring in other series. They would not work together again. In the years that followed, Karen received countless interview requests about her time on Little House. Fans wanted behind-the-scenes stories, warm anecdotes about life on set, and affirmations that the wholesome Ingalls family they loved was just as perfect in real life. Karen gave them what they wanted, or rather, she gave them what she felt she could. She spoke about the beauty of the Prairie sets, the joy of working with the child actors, and the camaraderie among the cast. But when the questions turned toward Michael, she kept her answers brief, steering away from anything that hinted at conflict. For a long time, that silence felt necessary. Michael Landon's death in 1991 had left fans grieving, and the public image of him as a beloved television father solidified in the years after. Speaking critically of him during that time would not only have been unwelcome, it might have been seen as disloyal. Karen understood that grief can make people protective. She did not want to tarnish the memories that viewers held dear. Privately, though, she was processing her own grief, both for the loss of a former colleague and for the parts of her own story that had gone untold. She had kept quiet during the show's run to protect her career, and she kept quiet after Michael's death out of respect. But, as the years went by, she began to see that her silence was also keeping her from closure. The turning point came when Karen was approached about contributing to a memoir. She had resisted the idea for years, unsure whether she wanted to revisit certain memories. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she wanted her version of events on the record. Not to tear anyone down, but to tell the truth about what it had been like to work under Michael Landon's leadership, both the good and the difficult. By this time, Karen was in her 70s. Her career no longer depended on pleasing the television industry. She had nothing to lose by being honest, and perhaps something important to gain. Age had given her perspective, and with that perspective came the ability to see Michael as both the visionary who made Little House possible and the man whose choices had sometimes made her job harder. When she finally spoke openly, it was with a tone of reflection rather than bitterness. She acknowledged Michael's brilliance, his relentless work ethic, and the way he inspired loyalty among his cast and crew. But she also spoke candidly about moments when she felt sidelined, about the inequities in pay, and about the creative control that left little room for others' contributions. For Karen, waiting until now had not been about revenge or public spectacle. It had been about finding the right moment when the noise of the past had quieted, when she could speak without the pressure of a current production, and when her words could be heard in full, not reduced to a headline. The reaction from fans was mixed. Some were surprised, even hurt, to hear that the man they idolized had flaws. Others appreciated the honesty, recognizing that truth does not erase love or respect, it deepens understanding. For Karen, the decision to finally speak was both an ending and a beginning. It allowed her to release the weight she had carried for decades and to reclaim her own story from the shadow of someone else's legend. When Karen Grassle's candid reflections on Michael Landon finally became public, they landed with the weight of decades behind them. For those who had grown up with Little House on the Prairie, the news was jarring. Michael had been more than a television star, he was a symbol of integrity, a comforting presence in the living rooms of millions. To hear that his leadership could be controlling, that there were moments of tension and inequity on set, was a reminder that even the most cherished public figures are human. For some fans, the revelations stirred anger. They felt protective of Michael's memory, unwilling to reconcile the man on their screens with the man Karen described. Others reached out to her with gratitude, saying that her honesty gave them a fuller understanding of the pressures that come with working in Hollywood and of the quiet compromises actors, especially women, had to make in that era to survive. Karen was prepared for the mixed reactions. She had no illusions that speaking her truth would be universally embraced. But she was surprised by how many people wrote to say they admired her for holding her story until she felt ready to tell it. In an age when celebrity feuds often play out instantly and publicly, her choice to wait decades lent her words a certain gravity. Her honesty also sparked renewed interest in Little House on the Prairie. Old episodes began trending on streaming platforms as fans revisited the show with fresh eyes. Some looked for signs of the tension she had described, while others simply wanted to remember the series that had been such a comforting presence in their youth. Karen was clear in her message. Her reflections were not meant to erase the joy the show brought, but to add depth to its history. For Karen herself, the aftermath was bittersweet. Speaking out did not erase the years of feeling unheard. nor did it heal every wound from her time on the series, but it did give her a measure of peace. She no longer had to dodge the truth in interviews, no longer had to pretend that her experience had been entirely idyllic. The burden of silence had lifted. She also found that her feelings toward Michael Landon remained complicated. She could acknowledge his faults without denying his strengths. She could remember the difficult moments while still cherishing the scenes they created together. The quiet dinners at the Ingalls table, the moments of resilience in the face of hardship, the shared understanding that they were telling a story that mattered to people. In many ways, that complexity became part of both of their legacies. Michael Landon's work continues to be celebrated, his place in television history secure. Karen Grassle's story now stands alongside it, a reminder that the creation of something beloved often involves unseen struggles. For the fans who could accept both truths, the revelations made Little House even more poignant. They understood that the power of the show lay not in a flawless reality, but in the way it portrayed hope and endurance, despite flaws, both in its fictional family and in the real people who brought it to life. Looking back, Karen has said that she believes the timing was right. She waited until the world was more willing to hear the complicated truths about icons. She waited until she could tell her story in full, not as a headline or a scandal, but as part of a life lived with integrity. And in doing so, she ensured that her voice, so often muted during the years she played Caroline Ingalls, would be heard clearly at last. For Karen Grassle, speaking openly about Michael Landon was never about tearing down a man who had already been claimed by history. It was about reclaiming her own place in that history. For years, her silence had protected the image of Little House on the Prairie that fans carried in their hearts. But it had also kept her from fully honoring her own truth. When she finally shared her story, it became clear that truth and admiration can exist side by side. She could respect Michael's creative brilliance while acknowledging the difficulties of working under his leadership. She could treasure the show's legacy while being honest about the personal cost. And perhaps most importantly, she could finally speak without fear. Today, Karen's voice stands as a reminder that the most enduring legacies are rarely perfect. They are human. They are complicated. And sometimes, they are strongest when the whole story is told. For more emotional stories, check out this video.